Hello, everybody. Anyone watching at whatever time of the day, welcome. I'm glad you've tuned in this morning. I'm having a lot of fun with these Facebook Lives. I've really missed them over the course of the summer, so it's good to be back. I'm going to pick up let me move my little note to myself. I have this little note here that I pin to remind myself that I have to look I have to look there to actually appear that I'm looking at you, because if I look at the main screen, good morning Brittany, it looks like I'm staring off into space. Anyway, that sticky note covered up my ability to see who's online and see anything you guys may have to say or anything like that. So anyway, having taken care of that very important detail, we're going to continue Mark chapter 11 this morning. Now, Jesus had just gone into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry, where he rode in on a donkey, and for one final week, he will hang with his disciples. He will hang with the Jewish people who follow him or who are interested in him. And at the end of the week, he will be crucified and then resurrected on Sunday. So this is the last week of Jesus' life leading up to the crucifixion and resurrection. And he spends a lot of his time talking about something very specific. And that's what we're going to get in today. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer. So this stuff can be seen as pretty deep. It's saucy. A lot of people are very interested in this stuff. But I want to remind you that at the end of the day, that there are people who give their entire lives. Good morning, Tracy. There are people who give their entire lives to looking into this one sort of vein of Jesus' teaching and vein of Scripture. And it feels deep at the same time. In any kind of, juicy, deeper insight can give us a spiritual shot in the arm. At the same time, if it doesn't help us to develop our character, develop the way we treat others, it might not be as deep as it feels. So I just would caution against going too far in exploration of this kind of genre, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. And I would advocate that you spend, and people disagree with me on this, but I would advocate that you spend most of your time on the plain teachings of Jesus, on the scriptures that talk about character, that talk about love, mercy, justice, forgiveness, actually doing things to help people and make the world a better place, because some of this stuff can take up a lot of hours, but at the end of the day, doesn't really make you any better. So here we go. Let me begin by talking about 70 AD or 70 CE and the difference that it made in the world, the significance of the events of 70 AD. Jesus, this last week of his life, the events of Mark 11, they would have taken place around 30 AD-ish, 30 CE-ish. And in 70 AD, pretty catastrophic stuff. So Jerusalem in 70 AD was surrounded by Rome. Rome had allowed Israel to do its thing as long as they stayed in line. Rome appointed the high priest and appointed much of the ruling council. They even cycled the high priest, which wasn't the way the Jews would have done it, but they did so that no one man could get too much power or too much love from the people. But around 70 AD, the Jewish people, Israel, the Israelites, had exhausted their welcome, and Rome marched on the city, surrounded the city of Jerusalem, and utterly destroyed it. I'm talking like scorched earth, like they crushed all of the structures, all the walls, the temple was torn down, everything was demolished and burned. Josephus was a Jewish historian who wrote a lot about it, very respected source. He talks about like blood flowing from the top of the city to the bottom of the city. And said things like, no one would even go near Jerusalem for many years because of the condition, because of the decay, the smell, just the awfulness that was associated with Jerusalem after 70 AD. And it sort of marked, spiritually, biblically, 70 AD marked the end in many ways of God's covenant. While that, don't get, for those of you who study this stuff, don't get too exhaustive with that, because God's covenant is eternal with Israel. At the same time, there was a clear end of the covenant means an agreement. And in the Old Testament, God had basically told the Israelites, you'll be my people, I'll be your God, I will protect you as a nation. You'll be a special nation for me if you follow my decrees. Morning, Kelly. If you love me, if you are generous, if you hang with me and me alone, if you love the poor. 70 AD marked a clear, like, okay, that didn't work out. And a lot of what Jesus does the last week of his life is he warns people 70 AD is coming. Now, he doesn't call it by the date, but he said there's going to be a time coming when, because of Israel's unfaithfulness, God squashes you. So understand, people, that is coming. So a lot of what we're going to read now points to that. So Jesus is marching into Jerusalem for the last week of his life, and Jerusalem is spectacular. It would have been tough for anyone to understand how in just a few decades the whole thing would be crushed, leveled, done. The Israelites would not have a home for, good morning, Vicky, would not have a home for 1900 years after Rome was done with them. So here we go. This is, I'm going to start in chapter 11, verses 12 and following. Here we go. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Jesus was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it. Now, the fig tree. And Jesus, and again, to read this like an ancient Jewish or ancient Christian reader, we're going to look for symbolism everywhere, because that's just what they did. For Jesus to curse a fig tree because it was not bearing fruit, every Jew that read that would have been like, oof, okay, this would be very similar if Jesus were here today. And he would, excuse me, I'm struggling with allergies again. If Jesus were to find a bald eagle, morning Shelby, and say, may bald eagles become extinct, us Americans would probably be like, ooh, did Jesus just, was that in reference to America? What just happened there? Same with the fig tree. All throughout Jewish culture, ancient Jewish culture, we find reference, and some of it stems from Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, comparisons with the Israelites to figs and fig trees. So for Jesus to curse a fig tree, it was probably more than he was grumpy because he wanted a snack and didn't get one, okay? So that's this first little image, and then it just says the disciples heard it. So Mark just kind of gets that simmering for us, and then he moves on. So Jesus speaks to something symbolic of the nation of Israel, and he curses it. Then we move on to this. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. So Jesus rolls into the temple, to the main structure at the center of Israel, to all that is representative of God's covenant with Israel. And he starts turning stuff over. He starts trashing the temple. What's going on here? Well, we learn a very significant detail, and no detail is wasted from these gospel writers, that Jesus refers to a passage of scripture, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it what? A den of robbers. Now that would have called everyone back to a passage that they would have been very familiar with growing up from the book of Jeremiah. Here it is in Jeremiah 7. Jesus does this all the time. Scripture readers do this all the time, where they make reference to an Old Testament scripture, and you're then, as the reader, expected to apply that situation to what's going on right there. So here's Jeremiah 7. Hundreds of years before this moment in the life of Jesus. Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? So there you go, den of robbers. Behold, I myself have seen it, declares the Lord. Go now to my place that was Shiloh. That was a house of worship at Shiloh, where I made my name dwell at first, and see what I did to it because of the evil of my people Israel. And now, because you have done all these things, declares the Lord, when I spoke to you persistently, you did not listen. And when I called you, you did not answer. Therefore, I will do to the house that is called by my name, the temple, or the house of worship, and in which you trust, and to that and to the place that I gave to you and to your fathers, as I did to Shiloh, and I will cast you out of my sight, as I cast out all your kinsmen, all the offspring of Ephraim. Now let me tell you what Jesus is saying there. Is he's saying, what Jeremiah is saying is that God is saying, that was clear as mud. God's basically telling the Israelites, go look at the house of Shiloh if you think I'm kidding around. I tore that place down, your house of worship, because your hearts were far from me, and I'll do it again because you've turned this place into a den of robbers. Jesus then, hundreds of years later, starts trashing the temple and says this has become a den of robbers. So what's Jesus doing? Jesus is enacting, it's like a prophetic skit of what God is going to do to the temple. So we get back to back. Jesus curses a fig tree, and then Jesus, good morning, Jackie, Jesus wrecks or trashes the temple, alluding in doing so with his language to a moment in Scripture from hundreds of years ago when God said, because your hearts are far from me, I will tear down the temple. So all of a sudden, Jesus seems to be speaking into Israel, morning Scott, speaking into Israel that God is going to destroy, do some destroying. There's going to be some prophetic judgment happening to Israel because their hearts are far from him. This is, again, this all fits with what's going on here because God became flesh. His love was on display. And as a people, we, and I'm going to say we because it wasn't just the Israelites, they're symbolic of humanity. Okay, we rejected God because of the hardness and the callousness of our hearts. And so God is about to enact judgment on Israel. So we got the cursing of the fig tree, which says that. We got the flipping tables and trashing the temple. It all fits the same vein. It's not just because we read this today and we think Jesus is just mad. There's more than that. Jesus is speaking prophetically that something is going to happen to Israel. Then Afterward, this is verse 20. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away at its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. So, not only does Jesus speak against it, at this point, this fig tree actually shrivels up. It's dead. Okay, it was destroyed at Jesus' judgment. Now, we get into this very interesting, very famous passage of Scripture, very famous teaching from Jesus. Famous teaching of Jesus, and it's often misunderstood because we come at it from our 2020 minds, not our ancient minds, okay, our ancient Jewish minds. So here we go. Where am I? Rabbi, look, the fig tree cursed is withered, and Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, okay, keep that in mind, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also, who is in heaven, may forgive you your trespasses. Now, I only understand a little bit of what Jesus is doing here. It's interesting, and lots of questions to ask him someday with this. First of all, Jesus talks about moving a mountain with prayer, and you've maybe heard the mountain moving prayer, okay, or mountain moving faith. Well, here's the clearest context for how the earliest listeners would have taken this in, and it's a little bit different than how we do today. When Jesus says this mountain, it's very clear in the scriptures where he is in geographically, okay? Jesus is near Jerusalem. He's in Jerusalem when he says this. Jerusalem is referred to as a mountain because it's built on a mountain, Mount Moriah. And so when Jesus says this mountain, the clearest context is he's talking about Jerusalem. When he says this mountain thrown into the sea, well, things thrown into the sea, that was a very specific phrase in the Bible that refers back to, it started in Exodus 15. In Exodus 15, the Israelites were celebrating God liberating them from the Egyptians. And one of as the story goes, and many of you are familiar with the story, Moses parts the Red Sea, the Israelites cross, the sea then crashes. Well, much of Pharaoh's army was destroyed when the sea crashed. And as the Israelites celebrate in Exodus 15, they say the Egyptians and the chariots were thrown into or cast into the sea. And from that point on, that became language of God's judgment. So for instance, when Jesus is talking about children in Matthew 18, he says, if you mistreat a child, it would be better for you to have a large millstone attached or wrapped around your neck and be cast into the sea. It's talking about God's judgment. And so what Jesus is saying there in that prayer is, if you have faith, this mountain, Jerusalem, can be cast into the sea. So you get back to back to back. You get the fig tree, you get the temple, and now you have Jesus talking about Jerusalem being cast into the sea or judged. So while I'm sure that Jesus is just what he does. He weaves together so many different kinds of things and leaves you sort of in awe and a little bit confused at times. He's definitely talking about Jerusalem being judged when he talks about this mountain cast into the sea, but I'm sure he's also talking about praying in faith. Now, is he saying, you'll see the power of my prayer when you see Jerusalem judged? Maybe, but even at that, what's he do? He goes back to forgiveness. So maybe this is even this is even for future generations to understand, as they just endured or just witnessed Jerusalem being metaphorically or symbolically cast into the sea. When they see in 70 AD the judgment of God poured out on Jerusalem, they still have Jesus saying, and when you pray, forgive that God might forgive you. So even in the midst of God's judgment, when Jerusalem was cast into the sea, Jesus is speaking about mercy, new hope, new life, forgiveness, an environment of forgiveness, even in the midst of judgment. So we're going to continue on. Probably next week I'll sneak another one in, another Facebook Live in. We're working towards some of the parables that Jesus teaches that are often associated with the end of the world, but probably are most appropriately applied to this moment in 70 AD when God judges Israel for disobedience. Now, God is not done with Israel, but that was a pretty harsh moment in 70 AD that this stuff points to. So I will see you back next week. Have a great rest of the week and take care.